And welcome back to our panel discussion, Leveraging Hybrid Cloud Architectures to Deliver Federal IT, sponsored by NetApp and SAIC, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM, federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Richard McKinney, the Chief Information Officer at the Transportation Department. Kirk Kern is the Chief Technology Officer at NetApp U.S. Public Sector. And Matt Livingston, Cloud Computing Architect for SAIC. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And, of course, applications is why any computing facility of any sort is there, because that's why we do it. And so let's talk about preparing apps a little bit for moving to hybrid cloud environments, because you may have an application instance running down the hall and one running across the state. And so let's talk about, Kirk, why don't we start with you? What are some of the preparatory measures that are good for when you're going to be entering into a hybrid environment with an application?
Sure. Yeah. So there's some three aspects to any application and its operational runtime parameters. You obviously have the compute resources, you've got the memory resources, and you have your I/O resources. I think industry in general understands to a large degree how many cores you need to schedule and how much memory an application needs to operate on. But the I/O perspectives tend to be a little more opaque, right? And so it's hard for a user or even an application developer to directly communicate what he believes his I/O parameters are in order to make that application run successfully. And so they tend to err on the high side, right? I need the best I/O performance that I can procure from a cloud service provider. And so what we have done is we've developed a series of techniques and some actual applications that go in and profile the path length from application stack through hypervisor down through the switches and then ultimately into
all the handoffs.
All the handoffs, mm-hmm. Right? And so we can characterize, at least for all of the workloads running in a data center, what that footprint is on the data center itself. So you could do a holistic approach where if I have a workload or everything that's running in my data center, what is required to pick up all of those applications and move them to the cloud, right? And so that will at least give you some categories of performance that you need to procure from the cloud service provider. There may be some cases where certain applications run at such a high level of I/O performance that you can't buy those in a cloud, and so you kind of keep those at home. And so that gives you at least the first set of guidelines as to what applications can be picked up and which ones can have to kind of stay home. After you do that, then you go into the per application profiling components, right? So you look at every individual application, is it configured so that it can, restart if it happens to have an I/O failure, right? Because when you go to the cloud, you have a lot of stateless nature, especially around the I/O resources. So you may or may not have access to your drives at the time that you want to commit that I/O request. There may be the cases where there's longer latency than expected, and how does that impact performance? And so that gives us the next set of technologies where, once you've understand those per application requirements, you unify the profiling of those applications both on-prem and in the cloud, right? So if you're going to start to consume hybrid resources, you want to be able to verify with a common set of parameters and metrics that the application that is currently running in my data center is running in the same fashion up in the cloud. Because what happens in cloud centers in many cases, the tools that you use to profile those applications in clouds aren't the same tools that you use in your data center. So you need to unify around tooling as well so that you understand if it's saying it's running at 50 IOPS here, is that the same 50 IOPS the same in that cloud resource? And so there's a sequence of initiatives that we put together to help our government customers make those steps to the cloud and then make sure that those applications run at their expected performance levels.
So, Matt, that implies there's a need for some compatibility technically in terms of the interfaces between the cloud provider, the external cloud, and one's own internal cloud.
Absolutely. There is a need for that, and there's a lot more standardization and common metrics, common standards and interfaces between the providers than there were several years ago. However, there still are a lot of differences and a lot of incompatibilities, and that's one of the things that we as a cloud services integrator focus on is what are the properties of the various providers? How do applications perform? How do they, what do those profiles look like if I put it in a Microsoft cloud or an Amazon cloud or a VMware cloud or some other cloud provider? And how does that compare to your on-prem performance? So So we've created a methodology that we call Cloud Migration Edge, and Cloud Migration Edge allows us to gather lessons learned from our own internal corporate application migration, both to private cloud, data center, as well as to public cloud for several applications, and as well as looking across all of our customer base so we can leverage lessons learned. So we have a catalog of different applications, different cloud service providers that we have partnered with and that we have helped move applications to, and we can use those metrics to build models. So when the next customer wants to move a similar application to a particular cloud provider, we can look across those and compare from a business perspective and a technical perspective what is the best fit.
Okay, well, let's ask Richard McKinney of DOT, what are you looking for in terms of application performance? Earlier you said that probably in terms of the mail that you're moving, it's going to be at least as good, maybe better. The users won't see a difference. What about some of the mission applications outside of mail? What do you look for? How do you plan for what you want it to look like and operate like?
Well, you obviously have to understand all the characteristics of the application. So you have to figure out what's the right fit for the application that you want to move up. We had an application earlier this year that was part of NHTSA. It was called safercar.gov, and it was an app that a very simple lookup app. It was very little code, very small application, but it did a simple chore. Is that if you put your VIN number, if a citizen put a VIN number into the application, that app would then go. The VIN number would tell the app, okay, that's a GM car, and it would go up to General Motors and it would pull down all the information about the recall history of that particular car, and could go at any one of the manufacturers. And it was the characteristics of that application is that it never had really had more than 3,000 hits a day. So it was a very small application, and I guess this is now about 8 months ago. The transportation, we announced a recall of the Takata airbags, and that application got slammed and it crashed. So that was the bad news. The good news is that the manufacturer said there's no sense hitting this app right now because it's going to take us 30 days for us to populate our databases with the information about which cars had the problem, which ones didn't. So you've got 30 days to figure this app out. So we lifted the app up, moved it up into a cloud architecture. We moved it up into Microsoft Azure. Re-architected the app a little bit, tweaked it a little bit so that it would be able to handle the load, and took us about 3 or 4 weeks to do all the lift and shift. And just about the time we got done, the Today Show did a story on the airbag recall, and sure enough, they popped the URL on the screen as they ran the story about the airbag recall. And that day, 15 million people hit that application.
Oh, my goodness.
And the application scaled up, ran, scaled back down. And we got I won't say the cost, but our monthly bill for that was nothing compared to what it would have taken for us to have architected an infrastructure that would have scaled up to 15 million hits a day. That's the thing I think that we all get excited about around the cloud is the notion that in the old world, when we would design an app, we would try to figure out exactly how much it was going to be used, and we would architect it according to its peak usage. And then all that really did was set us up for having an architecture that most of the times was idling along and not being pressed to its capacity at all. But you always had to design for the peak. The beauty of the cloud is you can design the app for the cloud, but the peak part of it, someone else handles that scaling, and you're not out the the investment.
All right, good. Great case history.
So, I love that message that Richard just made, though, because, when I consult with customers and they ask, Kirk, what application should I take to the cloud? They tend to think of maybe backup or disaster recovery or maybe some email, sort of standard applications, right, so to speak. And I try and push them away from those type of things, at least initially, and say, look across your infrastructure, understand what applications could benefit by using the elasticity and the scalability of the cloud, right? Do things with the cloud that you can't do with your existing infrastructure today. Pick those off. Show dramatic return on investment, and then work backwards to kind of get sort of the pedestrian applications migrated, right? And
That's great advice. That's great advice.
And I would agree. I mean, we're seeing that a lot of times some of the applications that are the most challenging, they might not have been the low-hanging fruit that people identified to migrate first, are the ones that really do have the greatest ROI. So the challenges are oftentimes worth it. We're starting to see more of a push to virtualize and migrate to cloud architectures for modeling and simulation-based training, and some of these applications that historically have been very challenging to move to the cloud, but really do see the greatest benefit from the elasticity and the scalability of the cloud.
And Matt, something you said earlier wanted me to ask you about the brokering model, which is coming more and more into this as companies like SAIC get into the cloud business, but may not be cloud providers themselves. And Richard had a model of direct interface between the agency and the cloud provider, as well as its own, in that hybrid environment, as well as its own data centers. But when using a broker, should the agency have knowledge and technical familiarity with what the cloud broker is offering behind that company's curtain? Or can you assure the customer, don't worry, it doesn't matter who they are, they're going to meet your SLAs? I mean, how does that relationship work, and how much transparency do we need in that particular handoff?
So in theory, I think, a broker should be able to say, I'll meet this SLA, and it should not matter. However, there's a lot of considerations for performance, security, and I think at the point where we are now, I think agencies are in a good position if they're doing their due diligence to look a little bit more behind the curtain and get a little bit more knowledge of what's behind those brokers and in the cloud service providers that those services are being provided from. And for us, we play more of the role of a cloud services integrator. So we help our customers look at cloud service providers, cloud service brokers, and help them figure out for their applications and for their business needs what are the most appropriate things to use. So that's a lot of the role that we help play, is to bring our knowledge of the cloud landscape and our lessons learned from past migrations and help people pick the best solution.
All right, so Richard, as you look ahead to more applications moving to maybe more to Microsoft or maybe other clouds that you might have, what do you anticipate your model being for who it is you end up actually in?
Well, I want to second what Matt says. I do care what goes on behind the curtain, so I will be, someone saying, trust me, I got this, I want to know exactly, I want to know more than that. So,
like that it's not in China, for example, or North Korea.
Well, no, but architecturally too. How it's architected. Their security, how they provision security. There's quite a number of things that I would want to put my head under the hood.
But you could still envision using a broker and a services broker, as long as you had that transparency through there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I wanted to ask about legacy applications where it might be really legacy. It might be written in a prior generation of programming language or one of the older languages, yet the logic is really important, and so some form of that application could endure for many, many years. What's a good strategy for getting those types of applications to a cloud where you get the benefits of scalability, elasticity, and so forth, cost, probability from the cloud? How do you do that with those types of applications?
Well, it's very difficult. I just spent a fair amount of time with my fellow CIOs, and we were out San Francisco talking to it, and we're in a number of sessions where we were talking. There's a big push around this in the CIO Council right now about identifying legacy applications. And the whole idea of how we're going to deal with these very old, programs written in COBOL, or other older languages. It's tricky because it's not only that's the language were the apps written where someone today can understand the business rules and requirements behind the logic behind the application itself. And as we think about having these applications rewritten in a more modern language, we find a lot of them are so old that
They're a black box.
yeah, they're difficult to understand. Maybe they weren't properly, documented at the time they were created, and there's no documentation that has survived to this point to say here's all the business rules and logic behind this code. So it's
It's a challenge.
it's a real challenge.
So this is an example where I'm a technologist, but I'm not really sure that technology solves this problem. Right? It's a business conversation in this case. You have to look at that application and ascertain that is it cheaper for me to maintain on premise with existing infrastructure, or is it more cost effective to take a set of resources, reprogram it in some next generation language that would make it cloud aware, and then you do the business trade of is it more cost effective to invest the programming resources and then consume the cloud services to re-enable that app so that it's agile and can move around, or if it's more cost advantageous to keep it on prem, you maintain that infrastructure and keep it going. Right, that's a classic hybrid cloud conversation to have. Right.
I would imagine, though, that given the policy of trying to reduce O&M, operation and maintenance expenses for these legacy systems, you could justify a redo of that app in terms of this is an innovation, this is development, and so it would help your ratio of development to operations and maintenance.
Yeah, but cyber is also a big driver in this as well, trying to reduce our attack surface. So.
This is one of the many reasons why in any cloud migration engagement, we always start with the business transformation engagement, because in many cases, this is the problem that you have is you don't know why an application was written, you don't know exactly what those business processes were, and in many cases, regardless whether the ultimate business decision is to rewrite the application in a cloud native architecture or to virtualize it or to leave it as is, at the end of the day, for continuity of operations, often understanding those business processes is critical.
All right, while we contemplate that one, we'll take a short break here. Our guests today are Matt Livingston, the Cloud Computing Architect at SAIC, Kirk Kern, the Chief Technology Officer at NetApp U.S. Public Sector, and Richard McKinney, CIO of the Transportation Department. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This is Leveraging Hybrid Cloud Architectures to Deliver Federal IT, sponsored by NetApp and SAIC, here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.